the way that I started getting podcasts for my podcast Digital Marketing Radio, which is started about 10 years ago or so, is I use a service called SourceBottle, and that still exists at the moment. And it is a way of getting guests. Essentially, it's a way of getting people that have something to share or probably sell is a better way to put it. And you can get people as guests as your podcast using that, but they are going to be a little bit more self-promotional. So to begin with, hopefully you've got your own audience, your own network rather, and certainly your own LinkedIn network that you can reach out to. Many people are comfortable being on podcasts, and I've found that only 5% of people ask things like, how many listeners do you have? And to be brutally honest with you, you don't want them on your show if that's what they're going to ask you, because at the end of the day, they don't appreciate where a podcast could go from a success perspective. You may have 10 listeners today, but if you keep on publishing good content, then it's likely that you'll have 100 listeners in a few months and perhaps 1,000 listeners next year. And that podcast episode that they recorded with you could keep on getting those listeners all the time. And for the half hour or so it takes to record an episode with you, for betting on the possibility of maybe getting over 1,000 people listening to that for half an hour of your time, it's a phenomenal use of your time. And I, I don't like that question. How many listeners do you have? And I tend not to have people as guests to do that because I've interviewed people that are exceptionally successful themselves, and they've come on the show because I've built a relationship with them, and they haven't asked those kind of questions. So I wouldn't expect to answer them, and don't feel that you have to answer them as well. Anyway, in terms of getting going with guests, another sneaky thing that you could do is to interview your target market as well. If you're having issues with perhaps building relationships with the target market, is you can even actually reach out to your target market and just simply ask if they would want to be a guest in your podcast. And it's not a sneaky way of trying to sell something to them. It's simply a way of recording a high quality podcast episode with them. And by mentioning your brand within the episode, they'll become aware of what you do, and they'll check out what you do as well because they've had a good conversation with you. So it's a good, fairly slow way, but quite successful way of building relationships with your target market. Remember to provide your guests with microphone tips as well and show format details. So I've always got this automated. I always like to send an email to people at least a week beforehand. This is the microphone that I'd recommend. If you don't have this, please get a headset. Don't use a Bluetooth microphone. And this is the show format details. So we'll talk about what we've discussed already for the first 15 minutes. Then this is the standard 5 questions that we ask in the second section. Here's an example of a previous episode. It's good for the guest to have as much information as that as possible. What to be a guest? Okay, I'm wondering what I meant to be by that. What to be a guest? I meant to say want to be a guest. Start your own podcast first. So I've had a few people in the survey that completed the survey for this particular training session said they want to be guests on podcasts. I would say start your own podcast first. Start your own 12 podcast series first. That will get you better at being a guest. It will get you better at using a microphone, more comfortable with the topic as well, and knowing what you should be saying, what you shouldn't be saying as well. But it also potentially will introduce you to other people who have podcasts. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water.
We'll forgive you. I was gonna say I'll use this as an opportunity, and I am filling a gap here. But however, you talked about the getting a guest on that could be a potential client, and actually that is also, I'm using the word powerful again, but that is powerful because if you've got even half an hour on a podcast, or 20 minutes, half an hour on a podcast, you have a very intense conversation, and you end up getting quite a close relationship with that person. And people buy from people that they like and people that they trust, and that does develop that relationship. So it is a bit of a slow burn, and it shouldn't be done for that purpose. But actually, guests can easily turn into clients, and so using target audience there's a lot of merit in that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Johnny. And as I said, if you want to be a guest on someone else's podcast as well, consider interviewing people who are podcasters already. There are 2.5 million podcasters out there. So identify which podcast hosts you would want to have on your show. And the great thing about them is, of course, they'll be experienced at using microphones. They should have higher quality. They should be more comfortable behind a microphone as well. But if you have them, first of all, on your show and you've built up that relationship, you're much more likely to be asked by them without even asking yourself to be a guest on their show.